Ever wondered why some stories just grab you and others? Well, they just don't. Or why certain characters feel incredibly real? Maybe why a plot twist lands perfectly?
It's funny, isn't it? Someone was asking basically those exact same questions, about 2,000 years ago.
And his answers are still shaping how we think about storytelling today. Absolutely. Welcome to the deep dive.
That's right, we're going way back, back to one of the real foundational texts of Western literary criticism.
We're diving into Aristotle's On the Art of Poetry, or excerpts from it anyway.
Yeah, we're using the Enneagram Bywater translation, which you can find on Project Gutenberg. And there's this really helpful preface by Gilbert Murray, too, gives some great context.
So our mission today, let's try and unpack Aristotle's big ideas about poetry,
Yeah.
particularly tragedy and epic poetry.
And see what insights we can pull out, right? What's still, really relevant for us now.
Exactly, those little nuggets.
And that preface is important, like you said. It reminds us this text. It might be based on lecture notes, maybe it's incomplete. And translating these ancient Greek concepts, across huge linguistic and cultural gaps, it's tough.
Words don't always map one-to-one.
Not at all. And the cultural context is just everything.
Yeah.
So we need to keep that in the back of our minds as we go.
Okay, definitely. So let's get right into it. Where does he start?
Well, he kicks off with this really fundamental idea. It sounds simple, but it's got huge implications. Poetry, he says, is a form of imitation.
Mimesis in the Greek.
Mimesis, yes. And it's broader than just like photocopying reality. Aristotle sees imitation as the bedrock for lots of arts, not just writing things down.
Like music, dance.
Music, dance, painting, yup. They're all modes of imitation in his view, but they differ in how they do it. He gives us 3 ways they differ.
Yeah, what's the first one?
First up is the means they use. What tools and materials are they working with?
Okay.
So he talks about rhythm, language, and harmony or tune. And these can be used on their own or mixed together.
So like a flute player uses rhythm and harmony.
Exactly. Or someone playing the lyre. And a dancer. They might just use rhythm alone to imitate character or feelings or actions.
And then there's language.
Right. The art that uses language alone, whether it's prose or verse. And interestingly, he points out that in his day, this kind of art didn't really have its own specific name.
Really?
Yeah, people just called writers poets if they used meter, even if they were writing, say, a science textbook in verse.
Okay.
But Aristotle's clear, being a poet isn't just about rhyme schemes, it's about the imitative quality of the work.
Gotcha. So it's about what you're doing with the language, not just the form.
Precisely. And then you have forms like dithyrambic poetry, tragedy, comedy. These combine all 3 means: rhythm, language, and melody.
Okay, so means is number 1. What's the second way they differ?
The second is the objects they imitate. What kind of things are they representing?
And this is where we start seeing different genres emerge, right?
Okay. Exactly. He says they imitate actions, and actions involve agents, people doing things. And these agents, he argues, aren't necessarily either good men or bad men or, people sort of like us in the middle.
Now, good and bad here. It's not quite our modern sense of morality, is it? The preface mentioned this.
No, not exactly. It's more about whether the characters are shown as, let's say, better than the average person, more noble, heroic, elevated.
Or worse than average.
Right. More base, maybe flawed, sometimes ridiculous. And this distinction is key. Tragedy, he says, imitates people who are better than us.
And comedy imitates people who are worse than us.
Spot on. He uses that great analogy from painting.
Oh, yeah. Polygnotus painted men better than they are.
Paz painted them worse.
And Dionysius painted them realistically, just as they are.
It maps perfectly. In literature, think of Homer's heroes. They're definitely better than us. Then maybe someone like Cleophon writing about everyday people, more on our level.
And then you get parodies, like Hegemon, making fun of people, showing them as worse.
And this difference in who is being imitated, it fundamentally shapes the art. It leads you towards either the serious forms, like tragedy and epic,
or the lighter forms,
Yeah.
like comedy, focusing on flaws and the ridiculous. Makes sense.
Okay, so that's means and objects. What's the third difference?
The third is the manner of imitation. Basically, how is the story presented?
And he gives 2 main ways here. First, the poet can narrate the story, sometimes speaking as themselves, sometimes taking on a character's voice.
Like Homer telling the story of the Iliad.
Exactly. Or the second way. The imitators present the whole story dramatically. They act it out as if they really are the characters doing the things.
And that gives us drama.
That's where the name comes from. Drama, from the Greek drawn, meaning to act or to do. So plays are dramas because the story is performed, it's acted.
Not just described on a page.
Okay.
So, to recap, poetry is imitation, and we can categorize it by its means, its objects, and its manner.
That's his starting framework.
And that idea you mentioned from the preface about poets meaning maker, it fits perfectly here, doesn't it? If the poet is a maker, but they're clearly not making reality itself.
Then they must be making an imitation of reality.
Right.
It seems simple, but it underpins his entire analysis. He's looking at the craft, the making of effective imitations.
Okay, so that's the what of poetry, according to Aristotle. But he also asks why. Why do we even have poetry? What's its origin?
He digs into this in chapter 4, Rooting It Right in Human Nature. He gives two main natural causes.
What are they?
First, imitation is just natural for humans, right, from childhood. He says we're the most imitative creatures around.
You definitely see that with kids, mimicking everything.
It's fundamental to how we learn. And the second cause, we all naturally take pleasure, real delight in seeing works of imitation.
Ah, the pleasure aspect. And this is interesting, because he connects it to the pleasure of learning, right?
Exactly. He points out that even if the thing being imitated is actually, painful or unpleasant in real life.
Like dead bodies or gross animals.
Huh. Yeah, things like that. Even then, we can find pleasure in looking at a really accurate, well-executed imitation of them.
Why? It's not because we suddenly like dead bodies.
No, it's because as we look, we're learning. We're recognizing, oh, that's what that is. Or we're appreciating the artist's skill, the execution.
So the pleasure comes from the understanding, the recognition, the craft.
Yes, that cognitive click. It's separate from how we feel about the real thing.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
It's the satisfaction of seeing reality captured and framed.
And it's these things our natural instinct to imitate and our delight in imitation, plus our aptitude for rhythm and harmony that led poetry to evolve. He says it started very simply, from improvisation.
Improvisations, like people just riffing.
Pretty much, initially. And as these developed, poets started going in different directions, kind of based on their own character or temperament.
How so?
Well, the more serious types, the graver poets, as he puts it, they gravitated towards imitating noble actions. That led towards things like hymns, praises of heroes.
And eventually, epic poetry and
Yeah.
tragedy.
Right. And then the meaner, or maybe more lighthearted poets, they imitated the actions of less noble people. That started with things like personal insults, invectives.
Ouch.
Ha, yeah. And that evolved into iambic verse and eventually comedy.
So the poet's own leaning influenced the genre.
Seems to be his view, and he holds up Homer as, like, the ultimate example.
Because he did both.
Well, he mastered the serious style, obviously, in the Iliad and Odyssey, but Aristotle credits him with outlining comedy, too, through a lost work called the Margites, which apparently focused on the ridiculous.
Wow. So Homer laid the groundwork for both tragedy and comedy.
That's the idea. He influenced both main branches, and as tragedy and comedy became more developed, more respected art forms.
Poets naturally started writing those instead of just sticking to epic or iambic verse.
Yeah, they were seen as grander, more complete forms.
And he mentions tragedy itself started improvisationally from the leaders of the dithyramb.
Yes, those wild choral hymns to Dionysus. And comedy apparently grew out of phallic songs, which were also part of festivals.
It's amazing how these major art forms grew out of these ritualistic, almost folk beginnings.
Absolutely. He describes them improving gradually, stage by stage. He gives milestones, like Aeschylus adding a second actor.
Which reduced the chorus's role and made dialogue more central.
Exactly. Then Sophocles adding a third actor, and also scenery painting. Tragedy gained seriousness, magnitude, moved away from its earlier, maybe rowdier, satiric roots.
And the meter changed too, from trochaic, which he links to dancing,
to iambic, which he calls the most speakable meter, the closest to natural conversation.
which is fascinating because you think of like Shakespeare using iambic pentameter in blank verse. It just sounds right to the ear.
It does. He makes the point that nature itself seemed to guide poets towards iambic as tragedy matured. It wasn't just an arbitrary choice.
Okay, so from our natural love of imitation and learning, through improvisation and poets following their inclinations, we arrive at these developed forms, with tragedy and comedy taking center stage. Now, let's really dive into tragedy. He gives a formal definition in chapter 6, doesn't he?
He does. It's probably the most famous bit of the whole Poetics. It gets quoted and argued about constantly.
Let's hear it.
Okay. He defines tragedy as the imitation of an action that is serious and also as having magnitude, complete in itself. in language with pleasurable accessories, each kind brought in separately in the parts of the work, in a dramatic, not in a narrative form, with incidents arousing pity and fear wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions.
Whoa. Okay, let's break that down. Serious, complete action of magnitude.
Meaning it's about something important, not trivial. It has a proper structure, beginning, middle, end, all connected, and it's big enough, substantial enough, to feel significant.
Language with pleasurable accessories.
That's the rhythm, the harmony of the song, used differently in, say, the dialogue versus the choral odes.
Dramatic, not narrative.
Performed, acted out, not just told.
And then the big one. Incidents arousing pity and fear, accomplishing a catharsis of such emotions.
Yeah, catharsis. That's the word everyone focuses on. The preface touches on this. It might have been an old ritual word, maybe linked to purification.
And Aristotle sort of repurposes it for the emotional effect on the audience.
That's the theory. Does it mean purging the emotions, cleansing them, clarifying them? People still argue. But the core idea is that the play deliberately evokes these specific emotions, pity for suffering that seems undeserved, and fear that something similar could happen to us.
And experiencing that is key to what tragedy does.
It seems central to his definition of its function.
It's fascinating. He then lists the components, the 6 parts of tragedy.
Right, the building blocks. You've got plot, he calls it fable sometimes, then characters, thought, diction, melody, and spectacle.
And he groups them, right? Melody and diction are the means. Spectacle is the manner, how it's staged.
And plot, character, and thought relate to the objects, the action, and the people involved.
Now, here's something that always jumps out at me. When we talk about stories, we often focus on characters first, right?
Yeah.
But for Aristotle,
plot comes first. Absolutely number one. He calls it the life and soul of tragedy.
the life and soul, that's huge. Why?
His argument is that tragedy is fundamentally an imitation of action, of life as it's lived through actions. Our happiness, our misery, it all arises from what we do.
So characters are important.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
But they're included for the sake of the action. The structure of the story, the sequence of events, that's the foundation.
He uses that painting analogy again, doesn't he? Plot is like the outline sketch.
And characters like the colors you fill it in with. You can splash beautiful colors on a canvas, but without a strong underlying design, it won't work as a picture.
So you could theoretically have a tragedy with like minimal character depth, but you absolutely cannot have one without action, without a plot.
That's his stance. Those really powerful moments, peripety and discovery, which we'll get to, they are parts of the plot. They're events, turns in the action.
Okay, plot is king. Characters are second, defined by their moral qualities, their intentions. Thought is third, what characters say to argue a point or express truths. Diction is fourth, the actual words used.
Then melody, the musical element, which he says is a major source of pleasure. And finally, spectacle.
The visual staging, costumes. And he considers this the least artistic part.
Yeah, he argues it depends more on the stage manager or costumier than the poet. And crucially, a really well-crafted tragedy should pack its emotional punch, even if you just read it or hear the story told. It shouldn't need the visual effects.
That's a high standard. The power has to be baked into the story itself.
Exactly. So if plot is number one, how should it be constructed? What makes a good plot?
Okay, chapters 7 to 9 really get into this. First, it has to be a whole, a complete action.
Meaning it needs a clear beginning, middle, and end. And these parts have to be logically connected, not just random points in time.
And it needs magnitude, a certain size.
Right. Not so tiny it's insignificant, but not so massive you can't grasp it as a unified whole. He compares it to a living creature too small, you can't see its form clearly, too big, like 1,000 miles long, you can't see it all at once.
So it has to be graspable by memory and imagination, long enough for the hero's fortune to change through probable or necessary steps.
And then comes this absolutely crucial idea, unity of plot.
This is where he thought many poets went wrong.
Definitely. Unity doesn't just mean the story is about one person, because, tons of unrelated things can happen to one guy over his lifetime.
Right, you can't just cram everything about Heracles into one play and call it unified.
Exactly. Real unity comes from imitating one single action, a complete whole action. And all the incidents within that plot have to be so tightly interwoven that if you remove or even just shift one incident,
the whole structure feels dislocated or broken.
Precisely. If a part can be taken out without making any real difference, then it wasn't truly essential, wasn't part of the unified whole.
And Homer gets praised again for nailing this.
Yeah, whether by skill or instinct, Homer got it right. The Iliad isn't about the entire Trojan War. It's specifically about the wrath of Achilles' one core action. The Odyssey is about Odysseus' return again, one main action.
Which is why, as he says later, a single epic like the Iliad might only provide the core plot for maybe one or two focused tragedies.
Whereas some other epics that try to cover vast stretches of time or myth might contain plots for, like, 8 or more tragedies, because their overall unity is much looser, they're more like collections of stories.
And this leads to that really powerful distinction he makes between poetry and history.
Ah, yes, chapter 9. The poet's job isn't just to report what actually happened. That's what the historian does.
The poet describes the kind of thing that might happen.
The kind of thing that's possible, according to probability or necessity, what could happen within the logic of the story.
And this is why he says poetry is more philosophic and grave than history.
Because history deals with particulars. Here's what Alcibiades actually did on the specific day. Poetry deals with universals. Here's the kind of thing a certain type of person would probably or necessarily say or do in this kind of situation.
So even when tragedy uses historical names, Oedipus, Agamemnon.
It's often because the fact that something did happen makes it convincing as something possible. But he notes some poets, like Agathon, just invented plots and characters entirely, and their plays worked just fine because they felt probable.
The key is that internal logic, that chain of probability or necessity connecting the events. He hates episodic plots for lacking this.
Yeah, where things just happen one after another with no real causal link. He calls those the worst kind. It feels arbitrary.
And he says that incidents stirring up pity and fear are most effective when they're unexpected, but also feel like a consequence of what came before.
That combination is powerful. Surprise plus inevitability. It gives you that sense of the marvelous, maybe even fate, like that story of the statue falling on the murderer. Seems like chance, but also like justice.
Okay, so structure is key. Then he talks about simple versus complex plots.
Right. A simple plot just involves that change of fortune, say, happiness to misery, but without these special devices called peripety or discovery.
And a complex plot does involve one or both of those.
Yes, and crucially, the peripety or discovery has to arise from the plot's internal structure. It can't just be tacked on, it has to be a result of the preceding events.
Okay, let's define those terms. Peripety.
Peripety is a reversal of fortune, a complete swing from one state of affairs to its opposite. Good fortune to bad, or sometimes bad to good, though that's less tragic, and again, it must follow probably or necessarily from the action.
The classic example being Oedipus.
Exactly. The messenger arrives intending to cheer Oedipus up, to free him from his fear about his mother. But in revealing who Oedipus really is, he achieves the exact opposite. He triggers the catastrophe. That's peripety.
A devastating reversal.
Okay.
And discovery.
Discovery or recognition is a shift from ignorance to knowledge. A character finds out something crucially important they didn't know.
And this often changes relationships, right? Leading to love or hate.
Yes, especially between characters who are on a path to good or bad fortune. Aristotle thinks the best kind is the discovery of persons realizing who someone truly is, or even who you yourself are. Like Iphigenia recognizing her brother Orestes.
Just as she's about to sacrifice him. Talk about high stakes.
Exactly, and he points out the very best plots, the most effective ones, combine peripety with discovery.
Like in Oedipus again. The messenger's arrival causes the reversal and leads directly to Oedipus discovering his true identity.
It's a double whammy. He sees these two, peripety and discovery, as the most powerful tools in the plot for generating pity and fear and driving the story to its conclusion. They're incidents, part of the plot's machinery.
And there's a third element he mentions alongside these. Suffering.
Yeah, suffering is defined pretty straightforwardly. Destructive or painful actions shown or described. Murders, tortures, woundings, deaths.
Okay, so a great plot is unified, complete, has magnitude, develops logically, and ideally uses peripety and discovery leading towards some kind of suffering. Now, what about the tragic hero? What makes the ideal plot in Hero?
Chapter 13 tackles this. What should poets aim for and what should they avoid?
Right. He rules some things out. You don't want a perfectly good person going from happiness to misery.
No, that just feels shocking or odious, he says. It doesn't produce tragic pity and fear, just outrage, maybe.
And you don't want a bad person going from misery to happiness.
Definitely not tragic. That's more like poetic injustice.
And even an extremely wicked person falling from happiness to misery. That doesn't quite hit the mark either.
It might satisfy our sense of justice or evoke general human feeling, but Aristotle argues it doesn't provoke pity or fear in the specific tragic sense.
Why not?
Because pity is for undeserved suffering and fear is for the suffering of someone like ourselves. We don't tend to identify with or feel pity for someone we see as utterly evil getting their comeuppance.
Okay, so who's left? Who is the ideal tragic protagonist?
He argues for an intermediate kind of person, someone who isn't outstandingly virtuous or just, but also isn't brought down by outright vice or depravity.
So, someone in the middle. Relatable.
Yes. And their downfall comes about because of some great error or flaw, hamartia.
Hamartia.
Yeah.
And the preface mentioned this is tricky to translate, not just tragic flaw necessarily.
Right. It could be an error in judgment, a mistake, ignorance, maybe even just a propensity for a certain kind of failing, or just being in the wrong circumstances. It's the thing that triggers the disaster for someone who is otherwise relatively good or normal.
And that's what makes it tragic.
Yeah.
We feel fear because they seem like us, vulnerable to making mistakes.
Exactly. And we feel pity because their suffering seems disproportionate to the error, somewhat undeserved. He thinks the perfect plot, according to theory, has this single focus, someone moving from happiness to misery because of this kind of hamartia.
And he points to the great tragedies focusing on families like Oedipus's or Thyestes as evidence. These stories are full of people who aren't purely evil but make terrible mistakes or suffer horribly.
Yeah, the myths themselves seem to provide the right kind of material.
Yeah.
He even defends Euripides, who got criticized for having unhappy endings.
Aristotle says unhappy endings are actually the right kind for tragedy.
He does. Even if audiences sometimes preferred simpler stories where the good guys win and the bad guys lose, those double endings, he says, are really more suited to comedy.
Interesting. And he circles back to spectacle again, saying pity and fear should come from the plot itself.
Right. It should work just hearing the story. Oedipus is his go-to example. The structure of the reveals is so powerful you don't need to see it staged to feel the horror.
And within the plot, the most powerful tragic acts involve family.
Yes, deeds done amid affections, as he puts it. Brother against brother, son against father, mother against son. The closer the relationship, the more potential for pity and fear when things go wrong. The myths are full of these.
But even then, the poet has choices about how to handle these terrible deeds. He ranks the options.
He does. The best situation, dramatically speaking, is when a character is about to commit a terrible deed in ignorance, like killing a family member they don't recognize, but then discovers the truth just in time to stop.
Like Virginia realizing Orestes is her brother. Maximum tension, then relief mixed with horror.
Exactly. That's considered the finest dramatically. Next best is doing the deed in ignorance and then discovering the truth afterwards.
That's Oedipus.
That's Oedipus. Then comes doing the deed knowingly.
Like Medea killing her children.
Right. Horrifying, but dramatically potent, and the absolute worst, according to Aristotle.
Knowing the relationship, intending the deed, but then failing to go through with it.
Yes. He finds that dramatically weak, unsatisfying, even odious, because it lacks the necessary suffering and feels incomplete.
Fascinating how he analyzes the dramatic impact of these different scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's quickly touch on character and diction before moving on. For character, he has four main goals.
Yep. Character should be first, good, second, appropriate, third, like reality, and fourth, consistent.
Good meaning they show some kind of moral purpose or choice.
Yes, even if they're women or slaves, though, he reflects his era's biases there. Appropriate means they fit their type or status. A woman shouldn't be overly manly, etc.
Like reality seems straightforward, believable as human beings.
And consistent means they behave in character throughout the play. Or, if their character is inconsistent, they should be consistently inconsistent, if that makes sense.
Ah, it does. He gives examples of failures too, right? Menelaus being needlessly nasty.
Ulysses lamenting inappropriately in some play. Iphigenia changing her mind inconsistently in Atlas.
And character actions, just like plot points, need to follow from necessity or probability.
Yes. Actions should arise naturally from who the character is. It all ties back to that internal logic. Plot and character have to work together seamlessly.
And the ending, the denouement,
must arise from the plot itself. No cheating with a deus ex machina, a god swooping in to fix everything at the last minute.
That's only okay for stuff outside the main action, like backstory or prophecies.
Exactly. The resolution needs to feel earned by the events of the play.
And he suggests painting characters slightly better than they are. like portrait painters making subjects handsomer but still recognizable.
Yes, elevating them slightly, like Homer did with Achilles, makes the imitation more compelling, more worthy of serious attention. He also talks briefly about different types of discovery, like using scars or tokens, versus discoveries that arise naturally from the plot, ranking the latter as superior.
Okay, we've got the essence of tragedy. What about the poet's actual process? Any practical advice?
Chapter 17 has some gems. He says the poet should visualize everything vividly, see the scenes playing out as if they were right there.
To catch inconsistencies.
Exactly, things that might look silly or wrong on stage. He mentions a playwright named Carcinus whose mistake only became obvious during performance.
So run the movie in your head first. He even suggests acting it out.
Yeah, physically embody those characters and gestures. He believes someone who can genuinely feel the emotions will write more convincingly.
Which leads to that idea that poetry requires either a special natural talent
Or a touch of madness, someone who can easily adopt the required emotional state or is genuinely swept away by it.
I love that, the inspired madness of the poet.
He also advises starting with the basic, universal outline of the story first. Get the core plot right, then add the specific episodes or details.
And tragic episodes should be kept pretty concise, right? Serving the main plot.
Yes, unlike epic poetry, where episodes can be much longer and are used to expand the poem, add grandeur and variety, he uses the Odyssey as an example. Lots of side stories branching off the main journey.
Speaking of epic, he does circle back to compare it directly with tragedy later on, chapters 23, 24.
He does. Lots of similarities, obviously. Both imitate serious subjects in verse. Both need that unified plot structure, unlike history, just listing events.
And they share parts like plot, character, thought, diction. Epic just misses out on song and spectacle.
Right. And Homer's brilliance in plot unity and characterization makes him the gold standard for epic, too. He sees the Iliad as a great example of a simple epic plot focused on suffering, and the Odyssey as complex, full of discovery and character focus.
So what are the main differences then?
Form is the big one. Narrative versus dramatic. Told versus acted.
And length. Epic is way longer.
Much longer, which allows for things tragedy can't do easily, showing multiple lines of action happening at the same time, incorporating many more episodes. This gives epic its characteristic scale and variety. Tragedy is more intense, more concentrated.
And the meter difference again. Heroic hexameter for epic.
Grave, stately, allows for grander language, unusual words. Iambic for tragedy.
More like speech, suited for action.
The form dictates the meter. And he praises Homer again for how he narrates, letting characters speak and act, minimizing his own direct narration. That's still a form of imitation.
He also talks about the marvelous or improbable. Epic gets more leeway.
Yeah, because the audience isn't seeing it literally performed. You can describe things in a poem that might look absurd on stage. His example is The Pursuit of Hector, where the whole Greek army just stops, works a narrative. Ridiculous visually.
So suspension of disbelief is easier when it's not right in front of your eyes.
Basically. And the marvelous is pleasurable. Homer's a master at making improbable things seem convincing, sometimes using clever logic tricks, paralogism, Aristotle calls it, making a lie seem believable.
So better a convincing impossibility than an unconvincing possibility.
That's the idea. But still, try to keep outright impossibilities out of the main plot structure if you can. Put them in the backstory or off stage. Homer's skill, he says, lets him get away with stuff lesser poets couldn't.
Homer really is his touchstone for excellence. Now, briefly, Aristotle also gives a way to handle criticisms of poetry, chapter 25.
Yeah, it's like a defense attorney's handbook for poets. He lists common criticisms. Some things impossible, improbable, morally bad, contradictory, or just technically wrong.
And he provides counterarguments.
Loads of them. You can argue the poet is showing things as they were, or as people say they are, or as they ought to be. Maybe Sophocles makes people ideally good, while Euripides shows them realistically flawed, both valid aims.
So it depends on the poet's intention.
Or maybe an apparent impossibility serves a higher artistic purpose, making something more striking, though ideally you'd avoid errors. You can also defend based on common beliefs, obscure word meanings, metaphors. It's quite detailed.
A very systematic approach to critical debate.
It really is, and he's clear. Some faults are worse than others. A flaw in the plot's core structure is way more serious than getting a minor detail about, say, chariot racing wrong, unless the flaw was totally unnecessary.
Okay, finally, the big showdown. Epic versus tragedy, which is the higher art form.
He tackles this head-on in the last chapter. Apparently, some critics argued tragedy was cruder, more vulgar, because it relied on actors' gestures and spectacle for a less refined audience.
How does Aristotle respond?
He dismisses that. Overacting is the actor's fault, not the art's fault. And besides, tragedy works perfectly well. Just being read, it doesn't need the performance to have its effect.
So what's his case for tragedy being superior?
It has everything. Epic has the plot, characters, thought, diction. Even the meter can be incorporated.
Plus it has music and spectacle as added bonuses.
Exactly. It has more components. And it achieves its specific emotional effect, that pity and fear catharsis, more intensely because it's more concentrated, shorter.
And it generally achieves better plot unity than most epics. Homer accepted, of course.
Right. So because it achieves the proper pleasure of poetry more effectively and completely, using more artistic elements in a more concentrated form, Aristotle concludes tragedy is the higher form.
Wow. Okay. That was quite the journey through the Poetics.
It really covers a lot of ground.
From poetry as imitation rooted in human nature, through that detailed breakdown of tragedy plot first, the need for unity and probability, the tragic hero's hamartia, those key plot devices like peripety and discovery.
And ending with that comparison with epic and his final verdict.
It's amazing how much of this, written so long ago, still gives us a language, a framework for talking about stories today. That systematic approach is powerful.
Absolutely. Thinking about plot structure, character motivation, the necessity of events. These are timeless concerns for anyone creating or analyzing narratives.
That idea of plot as the life and soul, characters serving the action, the sequence needing to feel inevitable.
Yeah.
It really makes you look at stories differently.
And once you start looking for peripety and discovery, those turning points, those aha moments, you see them everywhere. Ancient myths, modern movies, TV shows.
Definitely. So here's a final thought for you, the listener, as you go out and consume stories, whether it's a film, a novel, a series you're binge watching, even the stories people tell you. How do Aristotle's ideas land for you now?
Do you notice that unity of action or lack thereof? Can you spot the probable or necessary connections? Does thinking about hamartia or peripety change how you experience the story?
Does it enhance your understanding, maybe your enjoyment? Something to keep in mind.
Definitely something to mull over. It might just sharpen how you see storytelling itself.
A lot to think about indeed. Thanks for diving deep into Aristotle with us today.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to revisit the Poetics.